I just had a Jolly Rancher slushie. But I've been thinking about this for a week now. Last week in Battleground Core, we eliminated Antioptes, the Hypogean Sentinel. And it's really interesting because in this battleground, there are Vex taken deep into the core of Nessus. It's quite the interesting battleground, and it seems like there might be more to this guy than we think. After you complete that week's story, you get an interesting lore tab that we'll go over it in this video. So, this week I got a homework for you. These are keywords to look for and add to your vocabulary. Make sure to look out for these words for the rest of the season. Worms, whisper, voice, against, domination, anti, them, speaker, and quiet. Alright? Make sure to look out for those words, because they all might be super important. Because I think I figured out what Antioptes might have been built for, and it's all in their name. Well, as we all know, the Vex have a lot of connections to Greek mythology, starting with the less subtle part of his name, a Hypogean Sentinel. This term is pretty self-explanatory, since Hypogean basically means underground, and Sentinel is watcher. So basically, Antioptes is the underground watcher of the Vex on Nessus. As a sentinel and a soldier and or guard that keeps watch. It's big Cyclops, so yeah, I guess that's obvious. But the more interesting part of their name is what you get when you break that name down. If you grab the name Antioptes and break it down by anti, meaning against, op being similar to ops, which could mean voice or confronting, and tes can be aligned with the definition of them. So the name Antioptes could mean voice against them. That's a really interesting thing, because what is it against? And there are multiple ways to interpret this, because voice against them is quite interesting. What could this voice be against? Could be trying to drown out a whisper, perhaps. Recently we got back Whisper the Worm, an exotic mission in which we delve deep into the heart of Io, the first place the traveler blessed in the solar system, a planet brimming with light, and one with much interest to the Vex. This leads us to Zol, Will of the Thousands, exiled worm god of the Hive, aligned with Nokris, trapped beneath Hela's basin in Mars as a seemingly disappointing strike boss. However, Zol is the weakest of all the worm gods, which leads me to my next point. Zol, like many before and even after him, wanted to be, as Oryx described, axiomatic with the universe, to basically become one with unmaking and killing and stuff like that. So that's why in the lore tab for Whisper of the Worm, he says, wield me and use me to test your foe. Even in death, giving himself the sword logic. Like Nokris, Zol had a connection to the idea of living after death. Death being a metamorphosis. Existence asserted by violence. Zol was being sustained by the IO taken, even in death. In that way, he was technically immortal. And he still lives through us with Whisper of the Worm. This was achieved when he spoke with the Anthem Anathemy to become Hegemon, which Merriam-Webster, a hegemony, I don't know if I'm spelling that right, hegemony? I don't know. Probably that sounds correct. As a preponderant influence or authority over others, aka domination. It's clear that the Vex are being controlled by a new power, aka the Conductor, which is why the Taken were driven there. It's possible the Taken aren't there because of Zol, even though Zol has a connection to the Vex and the Taken. As I mentioned before, the Whisper lore tab reads, death is a metamorphosis. It's possible Zol might have changed into something else, become something different. I make this connection because Last week's lore tab is very interesting because it's describing a thing called a knot worm. Clearly, the writer wanted us to associate this knot worm with the worms, because otherwise they would have called it a knot worm. It is described as the Great Quiet Thing. Leads me to my next point, which leads me to something very interesting. Because where is another place we've heard about a quiet one? Titans might be ahead of me on this one, because Mask of the Quiet One, added in the Red War, the Quiet One reads as follows. Must you all be so dark? You're too focused on the horns. I have died hundreds of times, hunting the shadowed killers in Murder Row. I spent years mulling over Toland and Osiris's discourse on Thanatonautics. I have dabbled a bit myself and saw what lingers immediately upon all death. What I have done is found a way to channel the void, to draw that essence in before it is lost to the ether, to return it to the light, so it can be properly bestowed back on our enemies. Death does not need to be final. It can in fact be recycled. So what's so dark about that? Satomi, architect of the mask. There's a lot to unpack here. Clearly this Satomi guy is a guardian, you know, he's died thousands of times. He studied Thanatonautics. A lore tab added from D2's beta, Mementos from the Wild, mentions Satomi. And these are the only two places where we can read Satomi's name. In the Mask of the Quiet One, and in this Mementos from the Wild, stating the speaker thinks he's onto something, connecting Satomi to the speaker, and interestingly enough, Andal Brask, the former Hunter Vanguard, before Kate 6. This connection to the speaker plays into the key vocabulary of this week. The speaker being a voice in the light, and the quiet one being a voice, or rather, a silence, in the dark. There's only 2 entries mentioning Satomi, so not much is known about him, but his relation to the speaker gives me ideas. So, like I said, we don't know much, so this is mostly speculation and theory on my part. Returning to the theme of voices and whispers, maybe, just maybe, Mask of the Quiet One is similar to that of the Speaker's Mask, an instrument used to listen and interpret dreams. Perhaps the Mask of the Quiet One is linked to this great quiet thing we learned of in last week's lore tab. Both Whisper the Worm and the Quiet Thing mention death being a part of gaining power, to change and explore death, even mentioning the discussions between Osiris and Toland the Shattered on Thanatonautics. So could this Quiet One be some evolved worm somewhere deep in Nessus? Could death be some sort of cocoon from which the worms can enter and be changed? There is much talk, and they have listened through rock and metal and time, but they have not talked yet. But we're waiting and listening, waiting for them to reveal themselves. I know this kind of seems like well, we don't know what we don't know. However, it's clear that this not worm might have been a worm, or will be a worm, at one point. Possibly having crossed this road Zol and Nokris walked. It's important that we acknowledge the Taken presence and its association with Zol. Zol had some command over the Taken on Io during the Whisper mission, and if this not worm is related to, or is Zol, that has now gone through some metamorphosis into some dark thing, it may be important to the future of Nessus and the Taken we discovered down there. So during this episode, please look out for this vocabulary. Worms, whisper, voice, against, domination, speaker, and quiet. This is going to be important if we're going to figure out the mystery of the not worm, because if Antioptes is no more, then this underground sentinel might have been the one thing keeping it from surfacing once more. I'll also leave you with the question: Is the quiet one the same as the great quiet thing? If so, what does that mean for Satomi and Nessus? So, eyes up, Guardian. We got some vocabulary to look for this season. But that's it from me for this week. Keep an eye out, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Captain, I am analyzing the latest research sample you brought me, and it is of...
Penis!
I love him!